All right, again, we're still in the review. Factoring is something that either you love it or you hate it. So factoring is a topic and a skill that the only way to get better at it is to do it over and over and over and over and over again, and then do it some more just to make sure you have it down. The key to factoring is being able to identify which technique do you use. So when you're learning factoring, and you probably saw this way back in your freshman or sophomore year, maybe even 8th grade if you took pre-algebra or algebra 1 in 8th grade. And it's something that continually shows up. The problem is we don't continually practice it. And so in business calculus, it will periodically show up and you have to identify it. You have to realize, okay, my factoring skills have to come back into play. We will not use it all the time, but it's there just enough to drive you crazy if you haven't kept up on your skills. So there are 6 different techniques in factoring. There's the greatest common factor. That's just when you have something in common and you pull it out. There's the factoring by grouping, and we know it's factoring by grouping because there will be 4 terms, okay? Then we have a trinomial where 1 is in front of the x squared, okay? In that case, and we're going to do a couple of them, in that case, you're just finding 2 values that give you c, that when you add them up, you get b, okay? Then there's the trinomial where a is not 1. A can be a positive or negative. It can't be 0, but it can be a positive or a negative. And I teach it using the AC method. Okay, so the AC method says you multiply a times c, you find out the value of that when you add you get b, and then you set it up to a 4 term. So the AC method takes you to factoring by grouping. Okay, and then there's 2 special cases. The 2 special cases are the 2 that you're going to see the most in this class. You're going to see a few of the trinomials, but for the most part, you're going to see the 2 special cases. The first one is called difference of 2 squares, and I'll give you an example of that. The other one is called a perfect square trinomial, and I'll show you an example of that. The 6th one is when you can't factor it. When you can't factor something, that's when you're going to go to the quadratic formula. Now, you can, if you're really good with the quadratic formula, you can completely forget every tool you ever learned about factoring and just use the quadratic formula. The problem with that is it takes longer. Factoring actually is much faster than the quadratic formula for many. I have had students in the past that they just completely forget factoring and only do quadratic formula. So that's completely up to you. Okay, so let me just give you a couple examples of this. Now, I do have videos posted of every single one. Every single one of these is a different video. So if you want to review that and watch it and make sure that you remember what the technique is, those will give you a lot more detail. So I'm just going to do a couple. So let's start with the perfect square binomial. So 6x squared minus 25. Okay, it's a binomial because there's 2 parts. It's the difference because it has a minus sign. So if it has a plus sign, you can't use this technique. It's only when there's a minus sign. And it's 2 perfect squares. So remember, a perfect square is a number that you get when you multiply the same value. So 2 times 2 is 4. 4 is a perfect square. 4 times 4 is 16. 16 is a perfect square. 5 times 5 is 25. 25 is a perfect square. The one that a lot of people forget is 1 times 1 is 1. So 1 is also a perfect square. Okay, so we have 2 perfect squares. You know that your exponent, the value, the variable with the exponent is a perfect square if it has an even number. If your exponent is odd, you can't break it in half. Okay, so in order to get a perfect square of a variable with an exponent, so like this, so 8x to the 8th power, 8 is an even number, I can cut it in half. So the square root of this would be x to the 4th. Because if you remember your exponent rules, x to the 4th times x to the 4th. What do you do with your exponents? You add them, okay, which gives you x to the 8th. So the root, and remember, that's what I'm looking for. What's the one number that I multiply together to get this? That's what your square roots are looking for. Okay, so with difference of two squares, it's a visual. You have to just see it, okay? I have two terms, minus sign in the middle. Both terms are perfect squares. I know I'm going to use this technique. So you're going to put two sets of parentheses. One is plus, one is minus, and I just take the square root of each term. So the square root of 16 is 4. Half of 2 is 1, so it's just 4x, so I put that in the first term. Square root of 25 is 5. One goes here, one goes here. Now, if you aren't sure that you did this correctly, all you have to do is multiply it back through. Use that distributive property or FOIL to see if it works. So let me show you. 4x times 4x is 16x squared. 4x times negative 5 is a negative 20x. 5 times 4x is a positive 20x, and 5 times negative 5 is a negative 25. Well, look, that right there cancels out. I have a negative and a positive of the same thing. So I get right back to 16x squared minus 25. So these you should never get wrong. Just take 30 seconds and just go back through and do the distributive property and make sure that you factored it correctly. Okay? So this is when you have an expression, right? An expression means there's no equal sign. If I had this equals 0, I'm still going to factor it the same way. But now, because there's an equal sign, now I have to figure out, well, what does x actually equal? So this is solving by factoring, okay? So I'm going to take, since this times this has to equal 0, that means my first term has to equal 0, and or my second term has to equal 0. That's the only way to get 0 when you're multiplying. One or both have to be 0. So you just set each term to 0, and then you solve. So I'm going to subtract 5 from both sides and divide by 4. So again, your algebra skills have to be on point. Here I'm going to add 5 to both sides and divide by 4. Okay? Now, if you notice, and hopefully you noticed this when you took business algebra, is when you set this to 0 and solve, it's always going to be this number divided by this number, opposite sign. That's the value because of this algebra skill of adding the opposite. So this becomes negative 5/4. This becomes positive 5/4. Okay? So that's one technique. That's that difference of two squares. The other one is a perfect square trinomial. So let's say I had 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. I always have to do it backwards. Okay, so how do you know it's a perfect square trinomial? First things first, it's a trinomial, right? We got it. Second thing is, the first term is a perfect square. The last term is a perfect square. So the minute you see that, it's a good indication that it's probably going to be a perfect square trinomial. So all I have to do, put a set of parentheses with an exponent of 2 on the outside. I take the square root of the first term, the square root of the last term, and use this sign right here. Use my first sign. Okay? Now, where does the negative 20x come from? Well, this right here just means 2x minus 5 times 2x minus 5. So again, you can check it. 2x times 2x, there's my 4x squared. 2x times a negative 5 is a negative 10x. Negative 5 times 2x is a negative 10x. Negative 5 times negative 5 is a positive 25. I can add my like terms, so I get 4x squared minus 20x plus 25. Okay, so you can check it that way. Here's another easier way to check it. If I multiply these two, okay, we know this is correct. if I see that this is a perfect square and that's a perfect square, if I multiply these two, so I have 2x times -5, and then double it, I get that middle term. Okay, so you multiply the two terms and then double it, because if you remember, I had a -10x and a -10x. It's doubled. So you multiply and double. If you get that middle term, you know you factored it correctly. Okay? So the rest of them, and again, if this was set to equal 0, right, now I have to find out what x equals. So I have 2x minus 5 squared equals 0. What undoes a square root? Remember your algebra skills. Something that undoes a square root, a squared is the square root. So this square root sign undoes this. So those go away. So I end up with 2x minus 5 equals square root of 0 is 0. And then I'm going to solve for x. So I get 2x equals 5, divide by 2. So x equals 5/2. And again, it's the opposite sign, 5 over 2. Opposite sign, 5 over 2. And that's when you're asked to find out what x is. And again, the only time you have to do that is when it's set to equal 0, and that's solving a quadratic equation. Okay? The rest of them, you can go back to the other videos and see which one you need to review.